So I'm still in Walzer's Just and Unjust Wars, Part 1, The Moral Reality of War, and Chapter 2. This is the second video on Chapter 2. I'm continuing and finishing up on the crime of war. So remember at the end of the last video, Walzer says, talking about Walzer saying that it's a crime to start a war. And he wanted to unpack what that means. And ultimately, he's going to talk a lot about that in the next part, in part 2 of the book, under his theory of aggression. So this is an introduction, basically, to what he thinks is the unpacking or the meaning of this statement, and then it will lead into his theory of aggression, which he'll talk about later. All right, so let's just finish this chapter up here. So a basic intuition. Okay, if it's a crime to start a war, what would a basic intuition of that be? Like, why would we say something like that? Well, you know, if I say, oh, think about war, you're probably going to have kind of a quasi-abstract thing. You may not think of a particular war, but you might be imagining all kinds of destruction, you know, like cities on fire and planes dropping bombs and people just slaughtering each other, shooting each other. You might have pieces of war films you've seen and pictures, and it might be all this big composite. And then you might have images of, you know, after the battle, you know, the cities are wrecked and you have big silhouetted skylines of damaged buildings and all kinds of things. So basically, in a kind of abstract way, when I say, you know, you think about why is this war? Why is it a crime to start a war? You think of something like, because war is just hell, right? We always say that, like that's a common expression. It just kills people. It's a slaughter, and it just wrecks everything, right? It destroys infrastructure, all kinds of things. All the stuff that we use to live and enjoy, it ruins our theaters, our drinking water. Everything. It blows our libraries up, and it just slaughters everybody, and then it, you know, cuts out the power to the hospitals. It's awful. So this is this sort of general, like, unlimited, it's just carnage. Okay, that basic intuition, according to Walzer, is largely captured by the great Prussian thinker, 19th century Prussian thinker Karl von Clausewitz, in his famous book on war. So if you ever get a chance, have a look at that. That's a must read if you're interested in war studies. And so what is this sort of abstract notion of war that I was kind of getting at, this intuition of it's just this unbridled destruction, right? So war, really, we conceptualize war. What if we think about war conceptually in an abstract way, like war in itself? It's just this act of force. It's just, you know, just force from one side on the other, and the one's just trying to overcome the other. And if you start off with small weapons, the next person will run in with slightly bigger ones, back and forth, and it just escalates, right? It's just basic, just confrontation right up and just smashing everything. It's unlimited, right? It's just, you know, pardon the pun, it's just explosive, right? It's unbridled. And all the limits on this are, well, that's just a limit on war, like an externality imposed on war. But war is really just this, you know, this fantastic kind of eruption. That's really what the essence of war is. And the more that war is kind of unbridled like that, you're approaching this real notion of war that Clausewitz sometimes calls absolute war. And everything else is sort of like, if absolute war is kind of the Platonic notion of war, and everything's just sort of a reflection of it, or in kind of an instantiation of it with certain kinds of limitations, right? And Clausewitz was very philosophical. He was heavily influenced by a lot of German thinkers at the time, like, you know, and so he's got a very philosophical angle on it, much more than Walzer does, at least in the articulation of how to think about war. So again, Walzer's reaction is like, well, this is all really quite abstract. That war is this, you know, this conceptual notion, and limitations are kind of externalities imposed. No, this is purely conceptual. He doesn't think this is really going to work. And he says things like, even when you think about, you know, hell. And I started off by saying, well, think about war, and oh, war is hell. Walzer says, well, I can't even think about hell without thinking about scorpions and branding irons and people involved and all kinds of concrete things. And that's his point, is that this moving to war itself as an active force, compelled to make the enemy bend to one's will, or things like that, which are very Clausewitzian, those are too abstract. Let's look at this notion here as a crime, like why we think it's a crime, from a less abstract one than just this sort of total war kind of Clausewitzian framework. Let's look at it at this statement here and unpack it in a more concrete way, says Walzer. Okay, so what's that going to look like now? Well, rather than going with what I've labeled gamma, this war in itself as defined in this conceptualized way, which as it's conceptualized here, it's, as Walzer says, it's kind of devoid of context, right? It's sort of like this, all these random images that you've kind of decontextualized, right? And just said, well, it's kind of like that. And Walzer is saying, well, that's actually, by the decontextualization, you're getting a misunderstanding of what war is. War is really, as he says, kind of like a byproduct, right? It's a social creation, like art and lots of things we do. One is, it happens to be this sad thing we call war. This is what humans do, and humans impose it on each other, right? And however, let's just consider war as a social creation, and it simply is something that just has particular limits. So he's going to look at war, thinking about war and violence and all that stuff in a context, or better yet, he's going to look at various contexts and try and kind of tease out maybe a better understanding of how we can think about war. And ultimately, when we start thinking better about war, we'll get a better idea of why it's a crime. Because here it's just a crime sort of because it wrecks stuff. That seems a little bit too big of a net, because lots of things humans do wreck stuff. Lots of things are violent, but we don't think they're war and we don't think they're crimes. All right, so what he does is he looks at a variety of examples of violence and fighting. And you can think of lots of them. There's lots of things that humans do. Like he uses the example of jousting to start with, right? That can be really violent, really bloody. But we wouldn't think it's a crime to do it. Lots of human activities, certain sports, can be pretty rough, very bloody, quite violent. But we don't think it's a crime to engage in those sports, right? It might be interesting if you did something that's done in a sports context, that's okay. Like when a hockey player gives another hockey player a body check. That's okay in that context, but it's certainly not okay to go do that on the street. So we've got to look at, contexts are extremely important. So he looks at a variety of them, of contexts, of examples of violence and conflict and fighting. And some of them would be, again, quite violent, bloodshed and all this stuff. But we would say that, that's not really a crime. And even when we say, that war maybe isn't necessarily a crime, in some cases, we would say, when people are sort of volunteering and getting involved in all that of their own will, yeah. But sometimes we would also say that this violence and fighting can be a crime. Now, he goes through a number of examples, and you can have a look in the book. But the basic idea that comes out is, when is it really something that we would say that there's something criminal going on here with the violence? It might not necessarily be the violence per se, but it's when people are forced into it, when they don't have a choice, when they're absolutely forced for poverty or some kind of power is forcing them into a fight and to be in the bloodshed that they do not want to be in. So in that sense, that's where we can start calling it's a crime to start this, because you're forcing people into violence, right? If people naturally participate in it because they want to, that's a different story. But really, this notion of war is this large-scale kind of violence that people are forced to be in. That's what Walzer has said. Walzer is saying that's kind of where it's like a criminal thing to start a war. Now, it naturally kind of follows, you would think, that because he's talking about war in context, a social creation with its limits, that what's sometimes called the tyranny of war, the oppression of war, it's not like it's represented often, like Mars coming down, and he's got his arms and all that, and it's just war just breaks out. It just happens. Walzer is saying no, it doesn't. War is something that is a human activity, and we basically it's not some kind of god or mythological thing. War is not really like the weather that's just imposed on us. We do it. It's more like the production of art, and it's a social creation. We do it to each other. And so humans, as he says, impose it on each other. And this is where the criminal element is that those who impose this kind of violence on each other, those are the ones that's the criminal dimension of it. So why is it a crime to start a war? Because you're imposing violence on people. You could even impose them on to fight back, right? So people are going to fight back and defend themselves. And so they really, as Walzer says, you're forcing people to fight. You don't give them an option. They have no choice. They have to fight or they'll be destroyed. And so in that sense, the people who impose this, whether they're soldiers on the battlefield or generals in the back or politicians or whatever, the people that are really responsible for the imposition of this are the ones that are criminals. And in international law, when countries do this, when states do this to each other, when they impose it on each other, that is called aggression. And that's what they're guilty of. So in the end, unpacking this, why is it, what do we mean when it's a crime to start a war? Well, you're imposing this violence. You're guilty of aggression. And that's why in part two is basically Walzer is going to unpack this notion of aggression. In other words, he's going to construct what he calls a theory of aggression. We'll see that later, but in the next video, we'll look at the second distinction, that's involved in the moral reality of war that I talked about in the previous video, right? This is going to be looking more at justice in war. Stay tuned.